Today I wanted to talk about something that you don't necessarily hear that often about, unsung heroes in a way, and a thing that happens in the colonies in the 18th century a lot, but we don't really give a whole lot of thought to it, and that is who's drawing the lines on the map, or in this case, who's drawing the map around the lines. In 1727, early on in the 18th century, William Byrd II is part of a commission from the state of Virginia and another set of commissioners from North Carolina to survey the line or set the line that is the demarcation between North Carolina and Virginia. They have a couple of surveyors, what they call mathematicians, to come and help them, as well as, let's say, 15 or 20 woodsmen to go along with that group of people to survey the line between those two states. And of course, the king had sort of drawn a line, and there was an agreement between the two governors, but they didn't know where that line actually went. So they needed to send some folks to go in and survey that line. And William Byrd is part of that. He's part of the commissioners, and he's given the job of recording the events. And he does two sets. He does the public version that goes to the governor, and then he does his own private sort of correspondence with himself. I don't know if he really intends to publish it, but he kind of gives his own personal thoughts and about the private things happening with this. And this is published within the Colonial American Travels narratives in this book. You'll find a link down in the description section. Excellent book with four different journals about colonial life. And the secret journal, he actually gives funny names to the characters because he's saying not necessarily nice things about them, so he doesn't want to use their real names. It turns out, though, I think that as you read this narrative, that the true heroes of this are the woodsmen, the guys with their feet on the ground actually making this work. And in fact, you kind of get a real feel for it pretty much right away when he talks about the provisioning of this group of men and the accommodations. So most of the time, the commissioners, they have along with them two tents, marquee tent, and probably for the supplies, and then a smaller tent for their sleeping accommodations. They don't describe it more than just saying a tent. And the vast majority of the time, when they're out in the field, they're actually staying at local houses. The area that they're going isn't necessarily completely devoid of habitation, except for one spot. So they're staying in houses while the woodsmen and the guys actually doing the work are out there in the field. They don't have tents, they don't have anything, and I'll describe a little bit of their sleeping arrangement here when I get further on. Here, let's talk about the supplies for these men. Here, the commissioners were supplied with 2 kegs of wine, 2 kegs of rum, 173 pounds of bread, and several other conveniences. So there's what they've got here, and really they only talk about wine, rum, bread, and conveniences. And he actually says here the commissioners were supplied. Now, these are probably supplies for all the men. The funny thing about this bread is when he says bread, he probably means ship's biscuit, or we might term it in a later century hardtack. And it is very much hardtack because he actually describes one of the commissioners losing a tooth chewing on his ship's biscuit later on. Yeah, he describes here a few pages later. During the voyage, Shoebrush, which is one of his names for, I think, one of the North Carolina commissioners, in champing on a biscuit, forced out one of his teeth, which an unlucky flux had left loose in his head. Many times you'll have different sort of diseases in the 18th century, and specifically something like scurvy will loosen your teeth. So he already had a loose tooth and he busted it out. He was also complaining of gout, and he had to walk 2 miles regardless of his gout. These men had a lot of different health complaints as they were going into the field. We don't hear about the health complaints of the woodsmen who were actually out there in the field the whole time. Part of the places that they had to survey was this area known as the Dismal, or it was a large swamp. And the swamp was something like 30 miles long and 15 miles wide at the point where it needed to be surveyed across. And they were really concerned. They sent these woodsmen out with provisions into the Dismal. He writes, on the 14th, this morning early the men began to make up their packs they were to carry on their shoulders into the Dismal. They were victualled for 8 days, which was judged sufficient for the service. Those provisions were the blankets and other necessaries, loaded the men with a burden of 50 or 60 pounds each. Orion, that's a name of, I think, the surveyor, helped most of all of these loads so heavy by taking his bed and several changes of raiment, not forgetting a suit for Sundays along with him. So here are the woodsmen. They've got their packs, they've got their blankets, they've got their food, and the surveyor, who's sort of, the guy in charge of as they go out, he says, no, I want to take along a bed, specifically probably like a rope bed or something, and he wants to take a lot of extra clothes. Why he needs Sunday clothes when he's in a swamp, we don't know. Here's a bit about what the Dismal was like. Immediately we entered the Dismal, 2 men clearing the way before the surveyors to enable them to take their sight. The reeds, which grew about 12 feet high, were so thick and so interlaced with bamboo briars that our pioneers were forced to open a passage. The ground, if I may properly call it so, was so spongy that the prints of our feet were instantly filled with water. And among the reeds here stood white cedar, commonly mistaken for juniper. The commissioners sent off these men into the Dismal, and they went back to more or less civilization and stayed complaining about their lack of work to do and how boring it was waiting for these guys to finish their survey of the Dismal. They went on ahead where they expected them to come out of the swamp and waited, and these men did not appear suddenly, and they were kind of fearful of them. They knew that they did not have enough provisions with them to last the time that they were spending in the swamp. So there was some concern about these men who were struggling through the swamp, surveying of the line. So while these men are out in the swamp, the commissioners actually sort of get extra supplies. Other people send them things along the way. Let's see. Captain Meade sent a cart to the commissioners and brought to them 24 quart bottles of excellent Madeira wine, 12 pottle bottles, those are half-gallon bottles, of strong beer, and a half a dozen quarts of Jamaica rum. Now, the commissioners probably drank most of this themselves. They did send off some of the strong beer to the men into the swamp. So, very kind of them, I'm sure. He does go on to describe how the men survived in the swamp, and particularly their sleeping conditions. He says the way the men took to secure their bedding here from moisture in the Dismal was by laying cypress bark under their blankets, which made their lodging hard but much more wholesome. They had this problem with basically water being everywhere, and so they had to sort of make little piles of bark to keep them up out of the water so that they could sleep without just laying in the mud. And there's an earlier section where they had a group of woodsmen, and they had to sort of separate out a group that's going into the Dismal, and they actually fought for places within that group so that they would go. They exchanged lots, and some of them kind of bargained their way into that, knowing that there was some amount of glory to be had by undergoing the hardships of traveling through the swamp and doing this particular part of the mission. I'm not sure at the end whether they were so happy that they fought for their right to survey the swamp itself. This really gives us a great portrait of what life was like in the early 18th century in colonial America. Difficult to get a good grip on exactly what that is. This helps us a lot to understand what life was like back then. Life of regular people, common people, and well-to-do people, but a true picture of sort of what life was like. We can read a modern author and get a glimpse of that, but if we want to get a truer picture, reading these original narratives really helps that. I want to thank you for coming along on this journey as we traveled this line. We went back into the dismal swamp, and we can imagine how hard it was going and surveying that line and getting a picture of these people as they're doing it. I want to thank you guys for all your great comments and for watching our videos. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We do a lot of videos, a lot of them just like this, journal readings or cooking videos. So there's always great new content out there. I want to make sure you get those notifications, so make sure to subscribe to the channel. And thank you guys so much for all your great support, watching our videos, commenting, all that great stuff. Thanks for watching today.